have you seen the polls on Hispanics lately? I mean, the Hispanics, they shifted towards Republican in 2020, but the polls indicate, if anything, that that's accelerating since the 2020 election. I mean, it's really, I mean, they look like basically white people in some polls. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's really there was a significant amount of pretty bad discrimination in parts of California, Texas, New Mexico against Mexican laborers and so forth. But we have to remember the vast majority of Hispanics who are in the United States are actually post 1965 immigrants who are subject to civil rights laws, even affirmative action. And there's really no reason inherently to think that their ultimate trajectory would be any different than other immigrant groups who are somewhat darker than the average white American, right? Greeks or Turks or or Arab Americans or anybody else. There's just the Ford Foundation, among others, in the '60s decided, well, if we want to have a more left-wing America, we need to create more minority groups that will become constituents of the federal government. They had a very significant project to make Hispanics think of themselves as such and create an infrastructure like the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. And oddly enough, they were helped in this by none other than Richard Nixon, who was concerned about Chicano activist radicalism and Puerto Rican nationalism, and he felt like creating a pan-Hispanic identity would de-radicalize them by giving them a more American-centered identity, but also make them possible constituencies for affirmative action that he could pay off. And then the really interesting thing about it is, okay, well, then Nixon says, wait a second, but if we're going to help the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicans, who are in fact often of, more indigenous ancestry and look darker, what about the Cuban-Americans? They vote for us, but they're also overwhelmingly self-identified as white and lighter skinned overall. And so he added them. And once you add Cuban Americans, you can't really exclude anybody, right? Argentines, Venezuelans, because they're as European descended as just about any other group. So all of a sudden we have white people essentially who happen to have Spanish-speaking ancestries being considered a minority group. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Don't law schools though do ask you about Mexico? If I recall correctly, they ask you about if you're Mexican or Puerto Rican. They don't ask you if you're Hispanic, so they exclude Cubans. Am I remembering that right?
That was, interestingly enough, they used to do that in the Grutter case involving affirmative action at the University of Michigan Law School before the Supreme Court. The district court actually found the University of Michigan Law School's rationale for why they were engaging in affirmative action, which was diversity of ethnicity in higher education, couldn't be true because they limited the Hispanic category to Mexicans and Puerto Ricans born in the mainland. And clearly, if they wanted diversity, the more different Latino groups they had, the better. So University of Michigan denied that they had done that. The Supreme Court didn't really address the issue, but they denied it. They said, oh, no, we consider all Hispanics the same. And that, I think, is sort of the black letter law now. They do ask you when you apply to college which Hispanic group you're from. But I don't think that is necessarily meaningful in admissions unless for some reason they have like a Mexican American group on campus and they want to make sure they have enough students to keep it going, whatever. But as far as affirmative action goes, there's no difference between being even a Spaniard. Your parents could have been wealthy descendants of Queen Isabella, who've been dominating Spain for centuries and have always been a wealthy, powerful family. You come to the U.S. become a citizen, you're as eligible for affirmative action as the Campesino coming from rural Mexico who has a third grade education and is very dark skinned.
So yeah, I remember being interested in this stuff. So when I was 2010, I went to law school, and I remember that still being the norm. It was Mexican and Puerto Rican. I remember looking into it. Maybe I'm misremembering, and the
It's
Cubans were
possible.
still excluded.
It's possible that some law schools never updated their application materials, but I think that would, oddly enough, leave them vulnerable. Ironically, maybe leave them vulnerable to a lawsuit. The reason I say it's ironic is that the reason that Puerto Ricans and Mexicans were originally put into, in the 1950s, the federal government started monitoring its contractors for discrimination, and the categories were white, Mexican, and white, black, Mexican, Puerto Rican. Sometimes they had Jews on there, and then others. You could list other groups if you want to. Jews fell out. Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans were there because they had low socioeconomic indicators, and they were felt to be subject to race discrimination because many of them had significant Indian or African ancestry. So the idea was that they're somehow akin to African Americans, and they did face something like Jim Crow in some parts of the country. But now now it applies to all people who happen to have a Spanish-speaking ancestor. So, example I like to give, a lot of Latinos who I know who benefit from affirmative action, their ancestors fled Nazi Germany, stopped off in Cuba, or Costa Rica, or Argentina for a generation, then came to the United States, and now they're Hispanic. And why, Juan Goldberg, whose ancestors stopped off in Cuba, gets affirmative action, but Jonathan Goldberg, whose ancestors have exactly the same look, culture, ethnicity, and everything else, but didn't ever happen to speak Spanish, doesn't really make any sense, but that's what we have.
Yeah. So do you think you look back at the time in the 1970s when this Hispanic sort of identity, at least at elite levels, was sort of coalescing. Do you see more as if you had to, I don't know, maybe it's too intertwined to answer this question, but is it more the federal government, or is it like the Ford Foundation that's basically the impetus to have this broader category?
So Mike Gonzalez, who's at the Heritage Foundation, wrote a book about this that came out, I think, last year. He really emphasizes the role of the left-wing foundations and activists. But I think that the left-wing foundations and activists would have been perfectly happy to have like a separate Mexican-American identity and a separate Puerto Rican identity, and with maybe loose connections. And it was really, to a large extent, the federal government that wanted to homogenize this. And the homogenization was partly for the political reasons I mentioned, and partly because they have to count somehow, and the fewer categories they have, the easier. And how do you want to stop breaking up into every single different group? But also, this is getting more into sociology than my own expertise in law, but there was a strong sociological and economic reason for this, which is that when Univision was created, right, the national network of Spanish-speaking TV channels, they found that Mexicans wouldn't watch shows from Cuba, you wouldn't get it, from Argentina, and Puerto Ricans wouldn't watch shows from Mexico, and that was a problem for them, right? Because then they would have to appeal to all different markets. So Univision launched a big campaign itself to create a pan-Hispanic identity, so they could better market Spanish language programming from any country in Latin America to all American Latinos. We should go back a little bit. So Caspar Weinberger was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now the Department of Health and Human Services, in 1973. And he got this report from the education folks in saying, we're really having a hard time gathering education statistics because some of our sub-agencies are listing Mexicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans separately. Some are listing them as Spanish-speaking households. Some are listing them as Spanish surname. And, we can't, it's all apples and oranges. We can't compare the data. So Caspar Weinberger said, let's get some commission together with a bunch of different agencies and try to standardize these classifications. And they did, but they didn't do it in like any sort of, let's get together sociologists and population experts and the Census Bureau and all that. They did it in sort of, the one example that I know the most about is Hispanic. And what they literally did was they found one woman in the government who was Puerto Rican, one who was Cuban-American, and one who was Mexican-American, and they saw that each of these women would represent the entire population of this group, and they were just low-level, relatively junior government officials who volunteered to do this, and they just sat in a room and decided, we're going to call this what? Latino? Now we don't like that. Hispano, Spanish surname? No, we like it. We decide on Hispanic. They argued about for a while, they decided on Hispanic. And by deciding on Hispanic, we're excluding Brazilians, but including people from Spain. Why? Because we three people decided that Spanish descent is the key. And that's what happened without, there was no There was no real public debate about it, no real public discussion. No one really thought it was that important. The standards themselves, and this is really only for data collection purposes. We're not going to use this for determining eligibility for government programs. This is not meant to be anthropological or scientific in nature. And yet almost immediately it was used for government programs and has come to be considered anthropological in nature.